The moment my brother leaned over in that crowded courtroom and whispered, "You're finished," I almost smiled. He and my father had hired the most expensive probate lawyer in the state to strip away my inheritance. They looked at me standing there with no legal team, no family, and a lifetime of being underestimated, and they thought they'd already won. They had no idea that in exactly 5 hours, my father would collapse onto the courtroom floor, and the lie they had built about me for 32 years would shatter into a million pieces. If you've ever been counted out, pushed aside, or treated like you were nothing by the very people who were supposed to support you, hit that like button, subscribe, and lock in. Because this is a story about what happens when the people who hurt you finally have to face the absolute reality of who you really are. The Invisible Daughter. My name is Carolyn Reeves. To understand why I was standing entirely alone in an Ohio courtroom facing down my own flesh and blood, you have to understand the family dynamic I grew up in. Growing up, my older brother, Derek, was the golden child. He could do no wrong. If Derek forgot his responsibilities, it was just a harmless mistake. If I made even a minor error, it was treated as a fundamental character flaw. When he brought home average grades, my father would beam with pride and say he was trying his best. When I brought home straight A's, my father wouldn't even look up from his paper. He'd just ask why one score wasn't a fraction higher. For years, that rejection feels physical. It's a constant, dull ache in your chest. You find yourself shrinking, swallowing your own voice, wondering if maybe you really aren't enough. Maybe I deserve to be invisible. But there was one person who refused to let me disappear. My grandfather.
Colonel Thomas Reeves.
He was a retired Army officer, a Vietnam veteran, and a man who didn't throw words around lightly. When I was 13, after a particularly brutal verbal dressing down from my father, I ran behind Grandpa's garage, staring at the dirt, fighting back tears. Grandpa walked out, sat down on an old overturned crate next to me, and handed me a cold bottle of root beer. We sat in silence for a long time, just listening to the cicadas. Finally, he looked at me with those sharp blue eyes and asked, "Do you know why they're wrong about you, Carolyn?" I shook my head, keeping my eyes glued to the ground. He smiled softly. "Because they're measuring you with the wrong ruler." Part 2. A Life Built on Merit. Those words became my armor. At 18, I decided to lace up my boots and join the United States Army. When I announced it at the dinner table, the reaction was instant and suffocating. My father laughed, a dry, mocking sound. He told me I would fail within months. He said I wasn't strong enough, that the military would break me, and that I'd come crawling back home with my tail between my legs. Before the venom could fully settle in the room, Grandpa stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He looked directly at my father and said, "I remember saying those exact same things to you when you enlisted. And you quit." The room went dead silent. The air grew, so thick you could cut it with a knife. For the first time in my life, my father had absolutely nothing to say. I left for basic training a week later. And in the military, I found a world my family couldn't touch. The Army didn't care about family politics. They didn't care about my father's approval or Derek's golden boy status. In the military, results mattered. Discipline mattered. Competence mattered. And for the first time in my life, I didn't just survive, I thrived. Year after year, I quietly collected promotions, earned leadership positions, and took on federal investigations and legal certifications that most people my age couldn't dream of handling. Every single commendation felt like a brick building a fortress of proof that my grandfather had been right all along. Yet, back home, the record skipped on the same old tune. When I became an officer, my father changed the subject. When I bought my first home on my own salary, he asked why I wasn't married yet. Meanwhile, Derek was drifting from one self-inflicted disaster to another. Failed businesses, ruined investments, toxic relationships. And every single time Derek crashed, my father was there with a checkbook to bail him out. Then, our family's fragile ecosystem shattered. My mother passed away unexpectedly, taking what little stability we had left with her. My father curdled into a bitter, angry man, and Derek's entitlement grew into a monster. Through it all, Grandpa remained my anchor. I called him every single Sunday, no matter where I was deployed or stationed. Sometimes we talked strategy for hours. Sometimes we just sat on the line in comfortable silence. Then, the call I always dreaded finally came. Grandpa had suffered a massive stroke. I caught the first flight out. When I walked into that sterile hospital room, seeing this legendary, towering man looking so fragile broke something inside me. But when he saw my uniform, his eyes lit up. He weakly squeezed my hand, pulled me close, and whispered, "Still carrying the family on your back, Colonel." I forced a laugh through the tears. Those were the last words we ever shared. 2 weeks later, he passed away. At the funeral, I stood by his casket, feeling completely hollow. The only person who truly saw me was gone. But the true storm was about to hit. A week later, we gathered for the reading of the will. We sat in a high-end corporate office, Derek and my father practically vibrating with anticipation. The attorney went through the standard keepsakes and minor donations. Then, he reached the estate. Grandpa had accumulated a massive portfolio over his lifetime, properties, blue-chip investments, and liquid savings totaling several $1,000,000. The attorney cleared his throat, looked up over his glasses, and read the decree. The vast majority of the estate, including the primary properties and investments, was left entirely to me, Carolyn Reeves. The silence in that room lasted 3 agonizing seconds. Then, Derek actually laughed. He thought it was a typo. My father slammed his hand on the desk, demanding the attorney read it again. The attorney did. The words didn't change. In an instant, Derek's smug smile vanished, and my father's face turned an ugly, dangerous shade of purple. The accusations started flying like shrapnel. They screamed that I had manipulated an old man in his weak state, that I had used fraud, that I had stolen their birthright. 3 weeks later, they served me. They filed a massive lawsuit to invalidate the entire will on the grounds of undue influence and mental incompetence. And because they had hired one of the most ruthless, feared probate attorneys in the state of Ohio, they were entirely convinced they were going to ruin me. But I made a decision that left them completely stunned. I refused to hire a lawyer. I registered to represent myself.
Procès.
When my father found out, he told Derek I was throwing my life away. When we arrived on the first day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. People love a spectacle, and the narrative was simple. A legendary, high-priced legal titan versus a regular woman trying to play lawyer.
It was going
to be a slaughter. The opposing attorney spent the entire first day painting me as a calculated, manipulative villain who isolated a dying veteran. I didn't interrupt. I didn't get emotional. I just sat calmly, taking notes, watching Derek and my father smirk from the gallery. Then came day 2. When Judge Raymond Holloway walked into the courtroom, he wasn't just carrying the standard estate file. He was holding a second, incredibly thick, top-secret manila folder. I recognized the federal markings on it instantly. It was my complete, unredacted military personnel record, my advanced legal training, my federal financial investigation certifications, my years of analyzing high-level fraud for the United States government. The judge had spent the entire night reading it. The opposing attorney noticed the folder, and for the first time, the arrogance drained from his face. The judge looked over his bench, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the plaintiff's lawyer. "Counselor," Judge Holloway asked, his voice echoing in the silent room, "do you truly believe Ms. Reeves is at a disadvantage representing herself here?" The lawyer stammered, trying to hold his ground. "Your Honor, the law is complex, and as a standard citizen." The judge cut him off by opening the thick file, and then he began to read. He read my credentials out loud. He read my federal commendations. He read my strategic leadership evaluations. Page after page. Achievement after achievement. The courtroom grew so quiet you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, the judge closed the file with a heavy thud, looked directly at my family's expensive lawyer, and said the words I will never forget. Ms. Reeves does not need a lawyer. In fact, counselor, looking at her record in federal investigations, I think you should be worried about whether you need one. Absolute, suffocating silence. Derek stopped smiling. My father's jaw literally dropped. The opposing attorney scrambled forward, grabbed a copy of the file, and began frantically flipping through the pages. As his eyes scanned my real-world accomplishments, the color completely drained from his face. He froze. He looked back at my father and whispered, "Oh my God." My father grabbed the file out of his lawyer's hand. "What is it? Let me see that." And right there, in front of a packed courtroom, I watched my father read the truth. For 32 years, he had looked at a version of me he had invented in his own head, a weak, incapable daughter he could dismiss. Now he was staring at reality. He was reading about high-stakes operations he never cared to ask about, responsibilities he never bothered to understand, and a level of brilliance he had spent decades trying to suppress. His hands began to shake violently. The papers slipped through his fingers, scattering across the table. His face turned completely pale, his chest heaved, and suddenly, his knees gave out completely. My father collapsed heavily onto the wooden courtroom floor. Chaos erupted. Medical staff rushed inside. People were shouting, chairs were flipping back, and Derek was screaming for help. But I didn't move an inch. I just sat there.
Calm. Steady.
Watching the absolute weight of reality crush the illusions they had lived in for decades. Sometimes, revenge isn't about shouting or screaming. It's not about burning bridges down. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is simply sitting quietly while reality introduces you to the people who never bothered to learn who you actually were. As I walked out of that courthouse with my grandfather's estate completely secure, I realized the problem was never that I wasn't enough. The problem was that they had spent their entire lives measuring a giant with the wrong ruler. If that courtroom payoff gave you goosebumps, smash that like button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's the most satisfying piece of poetic justice you've ever witnessed in real life? Don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable stories just like this one, and I'll see you in the next video.